FBI files can become cold cases for any number of reasons. Sometimes a suspect is obvious, but without DNA or other evidence, there's no way to prosecute. In other cases, all the evidence is there, but it's still not until years later that the technology is present for these cold cases to be solved. One of the biggest ways the FBI helps to solve cold cases is through the Combined DNA Index System, otherwise known as CODIS. CODIS collects DNA from the perpetrators of various crimes and is available to law enforcement around the country. Through running cold case DNA through CODIS, cold case mysteries can often be reignited and the criminals tracked down. One recent case of this happening was in the case of Evelyn K. Day. Evelyn was a young mother who worked at Ames Community College in Colorado in 1979. Her husband reported her missing on the morning of November 27th, after he realized she hadn't come home the night before. We have a description of Evelyn's car, which was found parked at the side of the road later that evening. Inside, Evelyn's body was found, but she was no longer alive. Investigators managed to collect the DNA samples from Evelyn's body and confirmed her husband hadn't been the one to take her life. Beyond that, there was little progress made in the case, and it soon went cold. It stayed that way until Weld County Sheriff's Office hired a dedicated cold case investigator, Detective Byron Castellan. Castellan sent the DNA collected in the initial investigation to run against the FBI CODIS. There was a match: convicted felon James Herman Dye. Dye had been living in the area at the time of the crime and had actually studied at the college where Evelyn worked, though he wouldn't have been in classes with her. He had a history of disturbing and violent crimes, and his family and those who knew him claimed he was certainly capable of taking Evelyn's life. What's more, his name had already come up in the case. In 1988, a tipster called Crime Stoppers to say Dye was either solely responsible or was involved in taking Evelyn's life. According to the anonymous person, the night of the attack, he had come home in clothes that clearly indicated he had been involved in some kind of fight. He destroyed the clothes almost immediately, then told his wife about the crime before it appeared on the news. Unfortunately, no one followed up on this tip at the time. With the DNA evidence as well as other evidence that placed Dye at the scene of the crime, he was arrested earlier this year and is currently awaiting trial. A cold case more than 40 years old was finally solved with the help of FBI labs after human remains were discovered in 2019. Police received a call from an unidentified woman who claimed to have witnessed her mother's then-boyfriend burying a body in her backyard in Queens, New York when she was a child. Sure enough, when police followed the tip, they found human bones in bags precisely where the woman said they would be. Then they began the hard work of identifying who the remains belonged to and who had put them there. The witness said that the body had been buried in 1976. She recalled seeing her mother's boyfriend cleaning bodily fluids at the hairdresser's where he worked with bleach one March evening. The following morning, she woke early to discover the remains being buried in her backyard. She kept quiet for more than 40 years out of fear. The remains were so old that it was hard to determine much about the person they had belonged to. The John Doe was listed as a male, likely white or Latino, an age between 50 and 90 years old when he passed away. A cause for his passing could not be determined. Online sleuths got to work trying to connect the case to unsolved missing person cases from the 70s. But it was only after a private laboratory and the FBI took on the case that the victim would get his name back. Using genetic genealogy, investigators managed to identify the victim as George Clarence Seitz. George was 81 years old at the time of his disappearance and a World War I veteran. He'd become a chauffeur after his military service and was known as a recluse. He was known to carry large sums of money with him and was last seen leaving his home in Queens in December of 1976 on his way to get a haircut. Not long after the investigators revealed that they had solved the mystery of who the bones belonged to, an arrest was made. Martin Mata had been 29 years old in 1976 and owned a barbershop in Queens. A piece of evidence police have yet to make public linked Mata to the crime, and he was arrested in November of 2021. Police believe the motive for the crime was robbery, and haven't said exactly how much money was stolen from George on that day. The case is yet to go to trial, but this could finally close a 4-decades-old cold case. The FBI solved a 10-year-old international mystery when it uncovered a stolen piece of art in Miami in 2012. The Odalisque in Red Pants by Henri Matisse had been missing for around 12 years when it was finally found as individuals tried to sell it to undercover FBI agents. The story of the work of art goes back to 2000 and the Caracas Contemporary Art Museum in Venezuela. Somebody stole the painting, which was worth around $3 million, and replaced it with a crude fake. Despite the clear differences between the two paintings, nobody at the museum realized the heist had taken place. A change in government and a change of hands at the museum, and the fake still went unnoticed. It wasn't until an American art collector contacted the museum that the crime was noticed. The collector inquired about the piece, which was being sold in New York. When workers at the museum checked the artwork, they realized it had indeed been stolen. At first, the leftist government and the museum director that had been placed in the museum by the president was thought to be to blame. But photographs and documentation showed the painting had gone missing when the museum founder had still been in charge sometime in 2000. While the debate over who was to blame for the missing painting continued, Interpol and the FBI worked on trying to locate the piece. There was news of its travels around Europe, but nobody could ever find it. Finally, in 2012, the FBI got news from an informant that a Cuban man was trying to sell the painting. An undercover FBI agent met the man, Pedro Antonio Marzuelo Guzman, and won his trust. She convinced him to bring the painting to Miami to be sold. Along with an accomplice, Marzuelo brought the painting into what was a trap. After confirming they knew the painting was stolen, the two were arrested for conspiracy to transport and sell stolen property. The FBI recovered the painting, and eventually it was returned to Venezuela. However, the mystery of who actually took it in the first place remains unsolved. Marzuelo told officials he had acquired the painting from a man named Filberto, who knew who had originally stolen the piece. The mystery man was allegedly a Cuban American living in Miami, but Filberto had passed away in a motorcycle accident 2 years earlier. He may have taken the identity of this mystery man to his grave. The FBI file on the case is now closed, though even when the crime is solved, it's unlikely no one will be prosecuted due to the statute of limitations. When a CIA analyst disappeared in 1994, the fear that it might have had something to do with her work made her case an FBI investigation. More than a decade later, the case was solved, and it was something much closer to home that had caused her passing. Marie Singleton Jackson was a 46-year-old mother of 4 when she disappeared from her home in Los Angeles on November 11, 1994. According to her husband, they were supposed to be going to their child's football game, but she had drunk too much and said she was too intoxicated to go. Her husband, Andre Jackson, went alone. When he came back, Marie and her car were gone. He reported her missing the following day, and a few days later, a passerby spotted her gray Saab parked at the Dockwheeler State Beach. It was still locked, and some of Marie's personal belongings were found inside. The car's battery had been removed, and there were 2 parking tickets on the windshield. When investigators tried to pry open the trunk of the car, they found Marie's body. A robbery gone wrong was quickly ruled out. There was DNA evidence found under Marie's fingernails and on the hood of the car, but at the time, there wasn't the technology to analyze it. Jackson acted devastated when he heard his wife had passed, but police were skeptical over his outburst, especially when he was spotted acting normally shortly afterward. Police suspected Jackson was behind the crime. It emerged that he had only made one call to his wife when he realized that she was missing, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict him of the crime, and the case went cold. Years later, the case came up in a routine cold case review. The DNA found on Marie's body and car hadn't been analyzed, so investigators sent it to a lab. It confirmed that there was male pattern DNA, and investigators set about trying to find Jackson to see if he was a match. Marie's son, who had been 8 years old at the time, told police his mother and stepfather had begun arguing more and more shortly before she passed, and sometimes the arguments got violent. She had sat the children down and told them she and Jackson might separate. This contradicted what Jackson had told investigators about their loving relationship shortly after the crime took place. Jackson couldn't be found, but his son, Andre Jackson Jr., was arrested for an unrelated crime. Using Andre Jr.'s DNA, investigators could confirm his father had been the one responsible for taking Marie's life. The FBI fugitive team got involved in the hunt to track Jackson down. He was finally located in Arizona in 2008 and charged with the crime. In 2012, he was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life. Christian Tarantino seemed to think the best way to get away with crimes was to commit more of them. In 2012, he was finally put behind bars after work by the FBI and its partners on a decade-old cold case was closed. It was back in 1994 when Tarantino and a group of 3 other men targeted an armored car carrying money to a business in New York. The car had 2 guards inside. While Tarantino and 2 of his associates were dealing with one of the guards, the other was being attacked by Louis Dorval, the 4th member of their team. The guard, Julius Baumgart, was lying face down on the floor when Dorval pulled out a weapon and fired at the back of his head. All 4 men made their escape in a getaway car, which was later abandoned. However, there was little for police and the FBI to make any headway in the case. Dorval himself was a mob associate and involved in other crimes. 6 weeks after the heist, police issued an indictment against him for an unrelated racketeering incident. Tarantino worried about this. He apparently didn't think Dorval would keep quiet about the other crimes that he had been involved in, and would tell law enforcement about the heist. Before Dorval could be arrested, Tarantino and a few others took his life, put his body in a plastic trunk, and dropped it in the sea. For a while, it looked like Tarantino got away with his crimes. He created a lucrative gym business as the owner of Synergy Fitness Club, but kept in touch with his old friends. DNA evidence from the getaway car was analyzed, and Tarantino was a match. However, this wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. One of Tarantino's associates began to worry about his own safety when he heard news about the DNA. Vincent Gargiulio hadn't been involved in either of the 1994 crimes, but was worried his friend might try to drag him into the case if Tarantino was caught. He secretly recorded a conversation where Tarantino confessed to his crimes and ruled out Vincent's involvement. The tape was supposed to be there just in case, but after a number of business losses, Vincent tried to blackmail his old friend. He threatened to take the tapes to the FBI if he wasn't compensated. Instead, Tarantino hired a worker at his gym to take out Vincent, which he did on Vincent's way to work in August of 2003. This time, though, it wasn't enough to cover his tracks. Several months later, the tape was sent to the NYPD. FBI labs confirmed the tape was genuine, and Tarantino was finally arrested for his crimes. In 2 trials in 2011 and 2012, Tarantino was found guilty of his roles in taking the lives of all 3 men, finally bringing a close to this cold case FBI file. In 2011, photographer John Thompson of Bath, England, was searching through a second-hand bookshop when he came across creepy photos that he believed to be from the Edwardian period. Thompson purchased the negatives and took them home for further inspection, telling the Independent newspaper, quote, "I brought them home, put them in the loft, and forgot about them for 10 years. I discovered them when I was doing work in the loft, and I just started digitizing them to see if we could work out who the people in the photos were." After rediscovering the creepy photographs, Thompson embarked on a journey to solve the mystery once and for all. Thompson knew he wouldn't be able to do this alone, and in 2018, he created a Twitter account and asked fellow photography and anthropology enthusiasts for help. He began digitizing the photos and uploading them to his Twitter account, as well as uploading photos of the glass slides. One avid user pointed out that one of the cars photographed had a visible license plate, and the other users quickly chimed in, all trying to get to the bottom of the creepy photos. User MildThing99 was able to track down the exact location of one photograph that had been taken in Italy, even posting a side-by-side comparison of the road as it stands in 2021. After months of sleuthing and searching through records, the mystery was finally solved, and Thompson updated Twitter, announcing that he believed he had finally uncovered the true owner of these photos. Thompson believes that the photos were taken and belonged to a man called Sidney Fletcher, a banker who traveled around Europe with his family. Fletcher eventually settled in Somerset in the 1930s along with his family. The mystery of the creepy pictures had finally been solved, and Thompson continues to collect old photographs and negatives. The name JFK, the 35th President of the United States that is, conjures up controversy, as well as images of his demise and the conspiracy theories that followed. But did you know that there's another creepy photograph attached to Kennedy that has nothing to do with that fateful day in November of 1963? In December of 2009, TMZ released an article that contained information that could, quote, have changed the course of history forever. Within this article, they released a photograph of a man they claimed to be JFK, surrounded by nude women on a yacht. The story quickly went viral, and historians commented that had this surfaced at the time of his campaign run, that the course of US history might be very different. TMZ wrote that the photo was eventually given to a man who owned a car dealership on the East Coast. The man kept it in a drawer for years and would brag to friends that he had an image of JFK on a boat surrounded by women. The man passed away 10 years ago, and one of his sons inherited the photo. The photograph garnered a lot of attention and for a while became yet another scary photo connected to a prominent figure. Exact details are sparse, as the original article has since been archived. However, TMZ apparently ran with the story that this photograph had been taken in the mid to late 1950s, while JFK was on holiday. Historians were quick to chime in and call into question the photographer's authenticity. The mystery was finally solved after avid sleuths reverse searched the photograph, which led them to a 1967 photo shoot for Playboy magazine. Playboy was contacted and confirmed that the photograph was part of a 9-page spread from their November of 1967 issue about yachts and partying. Finally, the creepy mystery had been solved, and it was conclusively proved that the 1950s JFK photo had simply been a creepy hoax. Residents looked on in horror as the historic Wem Town Hall burnt down for the second time in 1995. The town hall had suffered a similar fate in 1677, and residents couldn't help but feel that the two incidents were supernaturally connected. Wem resident Tony O'Rahilly grabbed his camera and snapped a picture of Wem Town Hall as it was burning. It wasn't until after Tony had the photographs developed that he would discover that he'd taken one of the creepiest photos in modern history. After having his photos developed, Tony noticed a girl standing in the doorway of the Wem Town Hall, peering out at the crowd as the flames roared behind her. At the time, neither Tony nor anyone else at the scene reported seeing anyone standing at the door, and this photograph quickly became a scary piece of history. Tony was met with skepticism and decided to send the photo to the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena. The association declared that the negative is a straightforward piece of black and white work and shows no signs of having been tampered with. This only added to the eeriness of the picture, and people began speculating that the person in the picture was in fact Jane Cherm, who'd been responsible for the Wim Town Hall fire in 1677. Locals claim that Wim Town Hall is haunted by the ghost of Jane, but are unable to pinpoint why she chose that night to commit a similar act. For years, the creepy photograph was shrouded in mystery, and paranormal enthusiasts tried desperately to get to the bottom of the mystery. That was until 2010, when 77-year-old Brian Lear made a shocking discovery. As he was flicking through a local newspaper, he saw a reproduced postcard from 1922 and noticed that the girl on the postcard bore a striking resemblance to the girl in the 1995 Wim Ghost photo. Lear presented his findings to Greg Hobson, a photographer-curator at the National Media Museum, who commented that the postcard offers pretty conclusive proof that this is a hoax. He said, "I think we can say the mystery has been solved." Hobson went on to explain that the 1995 photograph was most likely a double exposure. He explained that the woman in the 1922 photograph would have been partly exposed on a glass plate, and the photo of the fire would have been taken on the same plate, thus overlapping the two. Of course, some people do not believe this explanation, and believe that this scary photograph is 100% genuine. Paranormal investigators still visit the Wim Town Hall in the hopes of catching a glimpse of the mysterious ghost and having their own viral creepy photo. Yupik Alaskan Susanna Stevens Johnson was scrolling through Facebook in March of 2021 when she came across an article that read, "Do you know the mystery behind these Alaska travel photos?" Intrigued, Susanna clicked the link and read the article that detailed how a German woman named Jennifer Schuppen had found the photo negatives by chance at a flea market in the Netherlands. Schuppen felt that she had a duty to identify the people in these photographs and return them to their rightful owners. However, being in Germany, she had little to no luck. She kept hold of the negatives as a creepy souvenir, hoping that one day the bizarre mystery would be solved. Years later, Schuppen decided to contact CNN, who are able to transcend borders and reach a much wider audience, and this idea paid off. At first, Susanna had pushed the photographs to the back of her mind, believing that the creepy mystery had nothing to do with her. But as the hours passed, she found herself thinking about them more and more. Susanna opened up the CNN article once more, and after flicking through a few pictures, she came across something that stunned her. One of the photographs was of her sister, Marcia, and she was staring right back at her. She turned to her husband and said, "Well, if she's in the picture, I've got to be in there somewhere." In a creepy twist of fate, just 2 photographs later, there was Susanna as a child, along with photographs of her deceased brother and other members of the Yupik indigenous community. Susanna contacted Jennifer via Facebook to relay the good news. Susanna said, quote, "Jennifer, it was meant to be that you found this. We don't have any photos of my brother when he was little, or even when he was older, and so that captured our hearts so dearly. Little did you know that the story contained in these slides would be so emotionally charged, they would shake a part of the world that you never even heard of." Richard Hulse was clearing out the personal belongings of his late father when he made a creepy discovery. Ian, Richard's father, had been a photographer in life and had taken photographs of many events, including weddings. While flicking through his father's album, he came across a wedding photo of a couple he didn't recognize. He flipped the photograph over, hoping to find some more information such as a date or name, but sadly the photograph was blank. Unsure of where to turn, Richard contacted the New Zealand Herald and asked them to run the story, complete with photographs, in the hopes that the happy couple were still alive and would come forward. Since his father had passed, Richard explained that he had no use for the photograph and wanted to present it to the rightful owners as a gift. Richard told the New Zealand Herald, quote, "When my father passed away, I inherited his personal archive of private creative work that he did when he was a professional photographer. It also included a whole lot of family photos, stuff from the 60s and 70s. Recently, I was looking through these photos for an image of my mother to scan, and I found a packet of negatives that was someone's wedding that was not part of our family." The New Zealand Herald finished the article by asking anyone with information to come forward, and it would take less than a day for the creepy mystery of the unknown bride and groom to be solved. On June 4th, 2021, a day after the initial article had been posted, another article was posted in the New Zealand Herald's website. After decades of being forgotten about, the photographs were finally reunited with the mysterious bride and groom, Janice and Ken Street. Janice told the New Zealand Herald, quote, "I'm the mystery lady who you put out a search for through some very old wedding photographs taken in 1967 from a really lovely photographer named Ian Hulse. It was February 4th, 1967, and I was 20 years old. I even still have the wedding dress, it's right beside me. I designed it, but I didn't make it." Sadly, Janice and Ken got divorced a few years after they were married, but Janice was incredibly moved to see new photographs of the wedding. While she and Ken are no longer a couple, she told the New Zealand Herald that she couldn't wait to show him the new wedding photos and relive happier times. When it comes to robberies, CCTV footage often determines whether the crime will ever be solved or not. When a criminal came into a grocery store in Banbury, England, demanding cash, even his full-face motorcycle helmet couldn't stop police from catching him. The robbery occurred at 8:10 p.m. on Sunday, August 12, 2022. The robber was wearing full biking leathers and a helmet to obscure his face. He told the cashier he had a weapon and demanded cash from the till. As the worker got the cash together, the criminal assured the man it would be okay as they had insurance for this kind of thing. He got away with less than 200 pounds and fled the scene on a distinctive bright green motorcycle. The police turned to the CCTV footage from the store to try to catch the criminal. It would turn out this wasn't the first time that he had visited the co-op. Hours before the robbery, a man was seen casing out the location. This time he wasn't wearing his helmet and his face was clearly visible. CCTV footage also allowed police to trace the bike to a man named Alan Thomas who lived nearby. Thomas realized the police were closing in on him and tried to hide his involvement in the crime. He spray painted his black helmet white, an act which was also captured on CCTV. Thomas then decided that wasn't enough and gave it to a friend to dispose of. He didn't get rid of the bike though, and police found it sitting outside of his home. On September 5th, police arrived at Thomas's home to arrest him. He threatened them with a pair of scissors, but was arrested without anybody being harmed. He pleaded guilty to the robbery and to carrying the bladed weapon that he'd threatened the officers with. Police located the perpetrator of a disturbing attack with the help of CCTV footage that showed the criminal with his victim in a quiet village in the early hours of the morning. It was shortly after 6 p.m. on March 11, 2022, when the badly wounded woman was discovered. A dog walker was alerted to the woman when his dogs began acting strangely. When investigating what had upset them, he discovered the woman semi-conscious and moaning quietly in pain. The attack had happened some 3 hours earlier, and the woman had apparently been left to pass away from her wounds. Her body temperature was extremely low, and if she hadn't been found, she would have succumbed to hypothermia. Luckily, she was taken to the hospital and treated for her wounds, which were both external and internal. Footage of the woman, which was later shown to a jury, was described as extremely unpleasant. The victim thankfully survived the attack and has not been named. Unfortunately, she had no memory of what happened. Police turned to forensics and CCTV footage to try to get to the bottom of the crime. It was discovered that there were 2 crime scenes. The woman had been attacked at the side of the road, where her clothing and mobile phone were discovered. She was then dragged into the wooded area where the attack became more vicious. CCTV footage from the nearby scene of the crime showed the victim walking with a man at 3:08 a.m. They appeared to be talking, but there was no sign of any upset between them. 50 minutes after they disappeared from the view of the security camera, the man returns, walking the opposite way alone. Police then pieced together the night before the woman was found. She had visited a bar with a friend. While there, they bumped into Matthew Stevens, who was introduced through a mutual friend. Stevens and the woman hit it off and exchanged phone numbers. At one point, they got into an argument and were asked to leave. For some reason, the woman chose to get in a taxi with Stevens. While in the taxi, the driver reported that the woman said that she just wanted to go home, but Steven convinced her to go back to his place in the village of Brunswick. When they were almost there, he revealed that his mother had forbidden him from bringing women back. They got out of the taxi and began walking. It was then that they were captured on CCTV, and moments later, the violent attack occurred. Police tracked down Stevens. Jewelry belonging to his victim was found in Stevens' wardrobe and he was arrested. He claimed he just wanted to hurt her, but he was found guilty of attempting to take the woman's life and kept the jewelry as a twisted trophy. On January 29, 2017, a group of criminals broke into a storage facility in England. They got away with hundreds of extremely rare books. CCTV footage was the first link in a chain of evidence that finally led to the group's downfall. The morning after the heist, workers arrived at the warehouse to discover around 240 books and manuscripts had disappeared. The works were only meant to have been held in Feltham for a short time. They were being stored for transit to a book fair and were only set to be held for the weekend. How the thieves found out about the storage was a mystery, but how they'd gotten in was obvious. The hole had been cut in a skylight. The thieves had lowered themselves down on ropes, which meant the alarm wasn't triggered. After packing the books into holdalls which were stolen from the facility, the thieves escaped the same way. CCTV footage revealed 2 cars that police linked to the heist. The cars were connected to a group of Romanians. It was then that police realized this was much more than one heist. Between December of 2016 and April of 2019, the group committed 12 commercial burglaries. The Feltham book heist was one of those 12 and by far the most valuable. The targets in the other heists had mostly been electronics. Whatever the target, the thefts were carried out in the same way. Once the criminals had made their escapes, they then traveled back to Romania, having been flown in especially for the job. The stolen objects were usually transported back with members of the gang and sold in Europe. Stealing the books would be the downfall of the organization. Not only were these extremely valuable from a monetary standpoint, but they were actually culturally significant. The books included works by Sir Isaac Newton, Galileo, and Francisco Goya. Unlike the stolen electronics, there was a lot of pressure to get the objects back and find the thieves that were responsible. A joint operation between the British and Romanian police carefully tracked down the individual members of the gang. DNA evidence had been left behind at a number of the crime scenes. In Feltham, a metal bar had been left by the gang. Officers found a drink can at another crime scene, and a half-drunken bottle of milk at a third. Intelligence was also providing names of members of the gang, but law enforcement had to be careful. There was a fear that the group would destroy the books if they knew that law enforcement was closing in on them. On the morning of June 25, 2019, a series of raids took place. More than a dozen individuals were arrested. 13 were charged for the robberies, including the Feltham book heist, but the books themselves remained hidden. It wasn't until September of 2020 when one final raid located the books, hidden in a cement pit beneath a home in northeast Romania. Even when a suspect in a true crime case seems obvious, CCTV evidence can be crucial to making sure the culprit is put behind bars. This was the case when Adrian Cheslick was found attacked in his own home in January of 2020. Adrian was discovered by his flatmate, Emma Tozer, in the early hours of January 12. She'd come home from a night out with her sister. They were arguing as they entered the Plymouth home, then heard a strange sound from Adrian's room. There, they discovered him badly wounded. He'd been attacked with a hammer. He was rushed to the hospital and passed away a few months later. Police searched the house for clues. When they found no signs of forced entry, they believed Emma and her sister were responsible for attacking Adrian. They would soon realize that that wasn't the case. Emma had an ex-boyfriend named Anthony Brenton. They'd met on a dating app, Plenty of Fish, and had gotten on for a while, despite Emma's friends and family not being too keen on Brenton. but he became possessive and controlling, and she eventually broke it off. Brenton then spent weeks terrorizing his ex-girlfriend. He stalked her and smashed a glass balcony at her home. He was convinced she was in a relationship with Adrian, which wasn't the case. On the night of January 11th, shortly before the attack on Adrian, he called Emma twice. The calls came from an unknown number, and Emma didn't even notice the calls as she was busy dancing. Brenton became an obvious suspect, but he insisted that he'd been home the night of the attack. He later claimed he'd been out drinking with a friend. Police went through local CCTV footage and found proof that wasn't true. He was spotted walking away from Adrian and Emma's home, carrying the weapon that took Adrian's life. He discarded the weapon in the ocean, then walked into the water himself. He got rid of his shoes and some items of clothing that he was wearing and was later seen walking home wearing just his shirt. Brenton was arrested and, after seeing the CCTV evidence against him, finally pleaded guilty to his crime. On June 26, 2022, Zara Alina became the victim of a complete stranger who was determined to attack a woman that night. In less than 2 days, CCTV footage led to the arrest of the sinister individual responsible for the crime. Zara was an aspiring lawyer who had recently passed her law exams. She wanted to have a job that would allow her to provide for her family. While career-focused, she found time to hang out with friends. On the night of June 25th, she went on a night out with a group of friends. A neighbor warned Zara to take the bus home, as there'd been some creepy individuals spotted in the area, but Zara chose to walk instead. Zara enjoyed walking and knew how to do it as safely as possible. She stuck to well-lit routes with heavy traffic even at 2 a.m., the time when she was last seen walking. Like many women, she also had a system where she would message friends to let them know that she had gotten home safely. Shortly after 2 a.m., she received 2 missed calls and a message from a friend asking if she had made it home safe. By that point, she had already been attacked. Police were alerted to the crime by passers-by who heard screams and then discovered Zara. She was still alive at that point but was badly wounded. A message about the attack was sent over the police radio and was picked up by CCTV operators. CCTV operators were able to go back over the footage and locate Zara walking home. She only lived 15 minutes away from where she had left her friends, but during that time, she'd captured the attention of a creepy individual. CCTV footage showed the man following Zara for a while before disappearing into a residential area. Later, footage showed the man coming out, but Zara had been left behind. CCTV operators worked backwards with the footage to discover that this man had been on a mission to attack a woman that night. After being kicked out of a pub, he began stalking a woman who went into a shop to try to escape him. When that didn't work, she managed to run home and got inside before he came onto her street. The man then found a new victim. 3 other women were stalked but managed to get home. Then he found Zara. The images were circulated to the police and a list of potential suspects were drawn up. They were all convicts who had a history of violence. Their fingerprints were compared against a partial print found at the crime scene. A man named Jordan McSweeney was a match. He was located in a caravan where he lived on a fairground and was arrested less than 36 hours after Zara passed away in the hospital. The clothes he had worn during the attack were found dumped beneath another caravan. He was arrested and found guilty of the disturbing crime and was handed a life sentence. It was a warm spring evening in 1967 when a disturbing crime shook the community of Staunton, Virginia. The case would remain an unsolved mystery until a shocking criminal confession would emerge more than 40 years later. At about 10:45 p.m., a customer went into the back room of an ice cream shop, only to find 2 employees, Carolyn Perry and Constance Hevner, on the floor. Each had a bullet in them and were not moving. Constance had already passed away. Carolyn would pass away a few hours later in the hospital. A witness named William Thomas, who lived across the road, reported 2 men running away from the shop in opposite directions. Residents had crowded around the crime scene to try to figure out what was going on. And when police tried to use dogs to trace the scent, the large number of people in the area had muddled the trail. Not much crime scene evidence was found. A little over $100 was stolen, which some thought was the true motive for the crime. But if that were the case, then that didn't explain why their lives were taken. There was pressure on the police to get the mystery solved, but little evidence to work with. The crime quickly became a cold case. At one point, the main witness, William Thomas, was arrested and charged with taking the life of Constance, but a lack of crime scene evidence found him not guilty. Nobody else was ever arrested. It wouldn't be until 2008, decades later, that the cold case would be re-examined. A cousin of Constance was contacted by someone named Joyce Bradshaw. She said a mysterious woman named Sharon Diane Crawford Smith should be reinvestigated. She was 18 years old at the time the crime took place, just slightly younger than Constance and Carolyn, and Sharon had once been a co-worker of the victims. According to Joyce, Sharon had once shown her a weapon in the glove compartment of her car and said she had a bullet for the Hefner girl. Sharon had been investigated decades ago and already passed a polygraph test administered by lead detective David Bocock. The detective also warned Joyce that Sharon was very proficient with the weapon in a way that seemed threatening, and from that point on, she didn't feel safe talking to anyone about the case until much later. With this information, police went to visit Sharon at the hospital. At first, she denied any criminal involvement, but eventually confessed to the crime. If her story is true, the crime was committed after Constance and Carolyn had been teasing her because she was secretly lesbian. She had gone to the ice cream parlor to confront them, and she took the lives of both women when the situation got out of control. Afterwards, she gave the weapon to Detective Bocock, who buried it. This criminal confession has never been confirmed by Bocock, who passed away in 2006, leaving the mystery partially solved. However, police were confident the story behind her crime was true. Out of respect, police waited until days after Sharon's passing in January of 2009 to reveal the true nature of her crimes. When William Scott confessed to taking the life of 22-year-old Terry Cox Monroe, he was already in prison serving 3 life sentences for taking a number of lives in the 1980s. Terry was the first of many. Terry was last seen at a club with friends on the night of February 21st, 1981. She was having a good time when she stepped out to get some fresh air and never returned. Her parents first thought she was staying with a work friend. When she didn't show up for work the next day, she was reported missing. Her clothes and ID were found not long after Terry first disappeared, along the bank of the Willamette River. A boater would find her body a month later in the same body of water. Terry's case went unsolved for more than 3 years until Smith was arrested for taking the lives of 2 women in 1984. Rebecca Darling and Catherine Redmond were found in bodies of water, but despite striking similarities, the cases weren't connected to Terry, and Smith received 2 life sentences on other charges. It wouldn't be until cold case detectives started working on another case that Williams was linked to Terry's case. Detectives were trying to solve the cold case of Sherry Irely, who had her life taken in 1982. While interviewing Williams, he let slip information about the other case. Police discovered he was at the same bar as Terry the night she went missing. It took several separate interviews, but each time, Williams divulged more and more information linking him to the case. He eventually confessed to taking Terry's life. Williams pleaded guilty in court and was handed another life sentence. The investigator working the case said that even though he would only serve 1 life sentence, it was important that he was held accountable for his actions. In early July of 1985, a Florida Highway Patrol trooper discovered the body of a young woman on Florida's Turnpike near Kissimmee. Inside of her body were multiple rounds in what was an obvious crime scene. Later identified as Carla King, aka Puppy Dog, she was a 23-year-old magazine model and an associate member of the Forbidden Wheels motorcycle gang. Investigators placed her traveling north with a man named Larry David Mooney, and his roommate, Douglas McKenzie, who was a member of Hell's Angels. To their surprise, Douglas had gone missing. When they questioned Larry about his involvement in Douglas's disappearance and why Carla was found at a crime scene, he denied any knowledge of the mysterious events. The case went cold and didn't seem to get all that much coverage. Larry moved from Florida to North Carolina, got married, and took the lives of 2 more people in 1999 and 2000. It wasn't long before Mooney was captured and found guilty of the 2000 crime. By 2002, he was going to pass away from a liver condition and wanted to be true about the other crimes, a confession of sorts to clear his conscience. According to his previously untold story, a new Harley-Davidson motorcycle was the true crime motive. According to Mooney, Douglas had stolen the motorcycle from him. Other sources claim Douglas bought the motorcycle himself, but Larry wanted it. Whichever is the true case, an argument broke out over the bike while the trio were traveling north. The argument escalated quickly, and Mooney took the lives of both Douglas and Carla. Detectives from Florida went to visit Mooney in prison to finally close this cold case. Due to extradition costs and health problems, he never faced trial, but police nonetheless closed the case. In 2005, Mooney passed away from natural causes, taking what he did with Douglas's body with him. In 2020, a cold case that had gone unsolved for decades was finally closed after a final confession from the criminal responsible. Virginia Hannon had been 59 years old in 1984. Though she had no children of her own, she worked as a lunch lady at the local school and would often bake treats for the students. She was also close to her nephew. Virginia had no known enemies, which was why it was so shocking when, in February of 1984, her body was discovered. A vicious attack had left a number of clues at the crime scene. Broken glass, a paper towel, and a pair of socks all contained traces of DNA evidence that didn't belong to Virginia. The criminal also left a boot print on her body while kicking at her. There had been a number of home robberies in the area, and police theorized that this was the latest work of the same criminal. However, none of the other home robberies in the neighborhood had ended this way, which investigators found strange and mysterious. Dozens of people were interrogated as suspects, but no criminal confessions were made. Over the years, Virginia's nephew and his wife made public appeals for information. Pembroke, where Virginia had lived, was a quiet community, and it seemed likely someone knew the criminal responsible. With the advancement of DNA technology, the forensic evidence found at the crime scene was eventually tested. All DNA was determined to have come from the same individual, and genetic genealogy gave 2 possible surnames. Despite these leads, progress in the case stalled, and it would take until 2020 to see the mystery solved. Police received an anonymous tip from someone claiming they were a close friend of Jesse Aylward, who in early 2019 claimed Aylward confessed to taking the life of a person in Pembroke many years earlier. The friend waited until the day after Aylward passed away before going to police. DNA confirmed Aylward was responsible for taking Virginia's life, but it didn't explain the true crime motive. Virginia's family members remembered seeing him in the community, but didn't know anything about the relationship between the two. Despite knowing who did it and when it was done, the final puzzling pieces of this unsolved mystery, the why, remains unanswered. A disturbing true crime story came to a strange and unexpected ending in 2021 when a man named Courtney Atlas confessed to taking the life of a young woman in 1968. The shocking criminal confession confirmed what many police officers believed over the years, but up until this statement, there had never been enough evidence to convict Courtney. As the true crime story goes, Pamela Dorrington was 19 years old when she mysteriously disappeared from her apartment in Helena in February of that year. Pamela was a bright young woman who wanted to study languages and become an interpreter. She lived alone in an apartment owned by Courtney and was last seen by friends on the night of February 16, 1968. Friends and family would spend the next 4 months posting missing person flyers and trying to solve the mystery of what had happened to her. The disappearance was out of character, but they held on to the hope that she would be found alive. That hope ended one evening in June, when a custodian at the gate of the mountain boat dock spotted something strange floating in the water. He was shocked to discover the partial remains of a missing person. After a pathologist's report, forensic investigators were able to confirm the young woman had passed away months earlier. What little they could recognize did match the description of Pamela. The clothing on the body also helped identify her. Courtney became a criminal suspect, but there was little forensic evidence, and the case went cold. He got married and resumed a normal life, but his marriage would come to an unexpected ending years later, and the body of his wife was discovered in the burned-out remains of their home. Investigators soon determined her life had been taken before the fire was started. In 1984, he was sentenced to 100 years in prison. Cold case detectives trying to solve the mystery of Pamela's case visited Courtney in prison in 2021. A 4-hour interrogation and confession finally solved the mystery of who had taken Pamela's life. He had told her there was a water leak in her apartment and he needed access. Once inside, he took her life and stored her body at an airplane hangar where he taught flight lessons. He later disposed of the evidence by dumping her over the York Bridge. Specific details convinced police that he was telling the truth, as only the criminal responsible would know them. Courtney was granted immunity in return for his confession, but will still remain a criminal behind bars for the rest of his life. A message in a bottle may sound like something from an adventure story, but this technique has actually rescued multiple people over the years. Messages in bottles date back to at least the 18th century, when sailor Chinosuke Matsuyama carved the story of his crew's shipwreck into wood from a coconut tree, and threw it out into the Pacific Ocean. Sadly, it wasn't until 151 years later that the bottle was found, and Chinosuke and his 43 companions had already passed away on a Pacific island. The delay in a message ever reaching anybody is a risk for anyone who relies on a message in a bottle to get help. The bottles are reliant on the sea currents, and it's often unlikely anyone relying on them can give their accurate location to anyone that may find the message. But for 80 migrants adrift on the coast of Costa Rica in 2005, a message in a bottle was their only option. In late May of 2005, 40 people from Peru joined 46 people from Ecuador at the Ecuadorian port of Puerto Montanita. All of them had paid thousands of dollars to professional smugglers to get them to the United States illegally. It's believed that their intention was to go through Guatemala, a trip that would have been more than 1,300 miles by sea. For a few days, the journey went well, but then the boat they were in began to experience mechanical problems. The smugglers who had been aboard abandoned ship into a second vessel. They took all navigation and communication equipment with them and disappeared back to South America. The stranded migrants were about halfway through their trip with no land in sight and no way to fix the boat and travel to safety. They had little food or water and were facing tragedy if they didn't find a way to get help soon. It was a few days before women on the boat came up with the message in a bottle idea. At this point, they were drifting about 300 miles off the coast of Costa Rica. Getting a message all the way to the mainland seemed impossible, but it was close enough for them to see fishing boats coming from the Latin American country. Fishing boats had seen them too, and one even tried to contact authorities about the boat, but there was no Coast Guard vessels available to get help. One of the migrants wrote a note pleading for help and tied it to one of the boat's drift lines. When the fishermen pulled in their lines at the end of the day, they found the note and again told authorities that help couldn't wait. A boat from a conservation charity on the nearby Cocos Island traveled out to greet the group. The migrants' boat was now taking on water, If they hadn't been able to get their SOS message to the fishermen, it's likely the story would have had a tragic ending. When Jeff Keyes went missing while on a hiking trip in the remote Jardine National Park in Australia, the only people who knew he had disappeared were the people he had been camping with, who he had only met a few days earlier. Luckily for Jeff, the group had grown concerned when he didn't return from a trip to Elliott Falls and alerted authorities. But even then, it was only an SOS scratched into the sand that led rescue teams to where he was. Jeff was a 63-year-old British tourist at the time. He had traveled around the world in what he called an adventure before dementia. On July 27, 2015, he had left the camp to go swimming in search of a remote waterfall. He wore no shoes and just shorts, a t-shirt, and a hat. But after several hours of swimming, he couldn't find the waterfall. It was 6 p.m. at this point, and he decided to return back to the camp. But rather than following the river upstream, he decided to cut through the dense bushland. It wasn't long before Jeff was entirely lost and unable to make his way back to the camp. The following morning, he found a waterfall he didn't recognize and decided it was best to stick to the river, following it downstream. He heard helicopters and guessed they were looking for him, but it would have been like looking for a needle in a haystack. When he came across a sandbank, Jeff got out of the water, grabbed a stick, and scratched a message. It read "Help 2807" with an arrow pointing downstream, the direction he was traveling. The message was the clue that rescue workers needed to find the missing man. Search coordinator Brad Fote was in a helicopter searching an area outside the initial search radius. He was about to move on to another location when he spotted the message. The helicopter continued downstream for a few hours before finally coming across Jeff, who was standing in the middle of a stream, jumping up and down with his hands in the air. Senior Constable Fote soon landed and rescued Jeff, who was taken to a hospital with a rescue story he could have never imagined when he started out on his adventure. When COVID-19 forced a lockdown in the UK, many areas asked delivery drivers to be on the lookout. It was feared cases of domestic violence would go up, and there was training to try to help drivers see the signs. But in some cases, protocols for what to do when postal workers see people in distress had already saved lives. James Tyler Jordan was threatening his wife, claiming he would take her life before taking his own, when a UPS driver knocked on the door in December of 2016. Jordan hadn't let his wife leave the house for 15 hours, dragging her back inside by her hair at one point when she tried to escape. He had physically attacked her and denied her food or water. The UPS driver was there to pick up a package, and thankfully, Jordan let his wife answer the door. All the while, he had a weapon pointed to her back, which the driver couldn't see. Even though she couldn't say anything to the delivery driver, it was pretty obvious she was in some distress. The driver picked up the package and left the house. Despite it being the build-up to Christmas and the busiest time of year for postal workers, the driver didn't rush off to his next appointment. On the box was a hastily scrawled note. The wife had managed to write "Call 911" on the package without Jordan seeing, getting a vital SOS message out of the house. UPS already had a protocol in place for what to do when they see a customer in distress, but the SOS message removed any shadow of doubt that the woman the driver had just seen needed help. He alerted authorities, and soon a SWAT team descended on the house. Jordan didn't resist and turned himself in. A number of weapons were found at the home, and the extent of his actions were revealed by the woman after she was rescued. The UPS driver that likely saved her life was never named, but his employer praised his role in the rescue. When Rene Compion found himself lost in the Angeles National Forest, he knew he needed to get help. He had low battery on his phone, and even though he had hiked through the forest a dozen times, had no idea where he was. He managed to get to a location where he had just one bar of signal on his phone, and sent a text to a friend, along with photos. The text read, "SOS, my phone is going to die, I'm lost." Only one of the photos went through. The poor signal meant that it was very low quality, but it was enough to get him rescued. The photo showed Rene's bare, mud-covered legs as he sat looking out over rugged, rock-covered terrain. Unfortunately, the metadata in the image wasn't much help. Rene had turned off the geolocation on his phone without realizing, so it was only what was in the picture that could be used to locate him. Rene was reported missing after he didn't return home from what should have been a 2-hour hike, and the search for the missing man began. Rene's car was found near Buckhorn Campground, but of course there was no sign of him there. After a day of searching, police decided to share the photo Rene sent on social media, hoping this wouldn't be the last photo this man ever took. Despite the low quality of the image and the lack of any other information, remarkably, a Twitter user was able to help. Ben Kuo has an unusual hobby. He likes to try to locate where photos are taken and find filming sites for TV shows and advertisements. Before, it had been a fun guessing game, but now it was going to save a man's life. Using information about where Rene's car was found, he began searching satellite images of the Angeles National Forest. He determined the photo had been taken on the south side of the valley due to the amount of vegetation, and cross-referenced the pictures with Google Earth at the exact time and date that the photo was taken. Once he had a match, he forwarded the information to police. Rene was found less than a mile away from the coordinates Ben had given authorities. He had been trying to get higher, figuring it would help rescuers find him, and was running dangerously low on water. When he was rescued, he was told that he was very lucky. In July of this year, employees at a Walmart in Pennsylvania discovered a handwritten note hidden in the women's restroom. It was a plea for help written by a woman who claimed she was being held against her will. The note insisted this wasn't a joke and asked whoever found it to call 911. The note was taken seriously, but sadly, this wasn't the end of the horrific ordeal an unnamed woman had been going through for more than 2 months. The woman had been reported missing by her ex-boyfriend in May. They shared 2 children together, and he hadn't seen her since April and had grown concerned. Police were contacted and went to the address in the note, an apartment owned by a 40-year-old man named Corey Brewer. According to the ex-boyfriend, Brewer and the woman were in a relationship, but it would turn out she had actually filed for a protection order against him the year before. That had only lasted a month though, and now it seemed like she was in trouble. Nobody answered the door when police arrived. They could only hear furniture being moved inside, and it sounded like someone was barricading the door. But without a warrant, there was nothing they could do. The following day, police were able to contact Brewer by his cell phone and asked to speak with the woman. But Brewer insisted the call remain on speakerphone and claimed that talking to the woman in private was impossible. She told police that she was in a relationship with Brewer and that they were on a trip to New York, but the woman continued to try to get help. The next day, she and Brewer took a trip to Falling Water Museum. She used the restroom while he waited outside and left another note. In it, she begged the police not to stop trying to help her. She had heard the police at the door of the apartment earlier that week, but the fact he was so close to being caught hadn't convinced Brewer to stop hurting her. She added that text messages had been sent to her friends and family from her phone, but that she hadn't written them. The note included a chilling line, quote, "If I don't make it, tell my family I love them." This spurred police into action. Now with a warrant, they went to the apartment again and searched the house. The woman was found and rescued. She had a number of wounds and her hair was unevenly cut, lining up with the actions she claimed Brewer had taken against her. Brewer was arrested and has been charged with a number of crimes. As recently as October, Usman Qasim was living the high life in a luxury apartment complex in London. The building, located in an area known as Millionaires Row, boasted a private spa and a rooftop swimming pool. A single apartment could cost up to £1 million British pounds, but Usman was a rather strange tenant. His capture in November of 2022 has placed him at the center of an international mystery that was recently solved. In April of 2020, Usman was driving a vehicle near Toronto, Canada, when, for reasons unknown, his passenger let bullets fly at a seemingly random car. Usman, who was already wanted for several warrants for arrest and criminal harassment, fled the scene before he could be apprehended. More than a year later, in October of 2021, Usman was involved in another criminal incident in the Toronto area. This time, he approached a woman in an underground parking garage and held a barrel to her. Police quickly responded and saved the woman, but Usman was able to flee once again. He managed to evade criminal law enforcement for more than a year, despite being the subject of several countrywide Canadian warrants. On October 1st, 2022, he was placed on a list of Canada's top 25 most wanted fugitives, known as the BOLO program, or Be on the Lookout. As of that date, Canadian investigators believe he was still in the country. Now, the recent mystery of his whereabouts has been solved, as evidence indicates he was hiding out in Europe for much of 2022. Usman was found in his elite London apartment and quickly placed under arrest. Police have yet to release many details about Usman's reportedly luxurious life in South London. However, press reports indicate that he's safely in custody in the UK and will soon be extradited to Canada to face justice. On August 16, 2015, a would-be robbery came to an unexpected ending thanks to the heroic actions of a Pizza Hut driver in Chester Township, Ohio. At just before 8 p.m. in the evening, an unidentified male entered the restaurant with a weapon and criminal intent. As the true story goes, the crime was thwarted by 3 employees, including Ronald Mansfield, a delivery driver for the franchise. Ronald and the store manager would later recall the unbelievable moments when the would-be robber attempted to case the store. He was quickly thwarted as Ronald grabbed the suspect's weapon and chased him out of the restaurant. Ronald then pursued the individual through a nearby park, but the person went missing. Police received several emergency 911 phone calls about the crime by store employees, as well as citizens who saw the unidentified man running down a street. When police arrived at the crime scene, the suspect had already escaped. However, Ronald was able to turn in the man's weapon, which contained DNA evidence for forensic investigators to analyze. None of the employees were harmed in the robbery attempt, and the would-be thief did not escape with any stolen money. For years, the cold case stagnated because the DNA did not match any known suspects and physical descriptions of the criminal were not enough to solve the mystery. Eventually, in 2022, the mystery was finally solved when the man got booked for an unrelated charge and his DNA was entered into the Ohio State database. DNA testing linked the man, Malachi R. Bell, to the 2015 robbery. As of December 1st, 2022, he's being held in the county jail where he's awaiting sentencing for his attempted death. On June 13, 1981, the remains of an unidentified man were found in a grassy area outside of Garfield, Arkansas, with 4 bullet holes. The man was wearing a dark-colored t-shirt, dark pants and sneakers, and a Timex wristwatch. Some sources indicate that he may have had a condition known as hydrocephalus, for which he received surgical treatment during his life. For decades, the strange and unsolved John Doe case remained unidentified. With the advent of new DNA technology, investigators began to hope that the unknown man's story could be uncovered. In 2019, a DNA profile was generated by the Arkansas Crime Lab. A close family member of the man was found, and in August of 2022, John Doe was confirmed to be Fred James Grow, known to his family and friends as Jamie. What makes Jamie's case an especially scary story, even though an identity has been found, is the cause of his passing, which has never been solved. In June of 1981, Jamie had been living and working in Fayetteville, Arkansas for some time when he left on a planned trip that would have taken him to Kansas City, Wichita, and Colorado to see family. Unfortunately, he never arrived at any of his destinations and went missing soon after. Prior to Jamie's identification in 2019, a retired investigator from Arkansas told reporters that police had long suspected that he'd been taken out as part of a botched contract hit. Further details about this scheme have not been released. When Jamie was identified, though, crime investigators were able to uncover some people who provided further details about his movements before he went missing. Prior to leaving Fayetteville, Jamie was reportedly approached by two women looking for a ride to Oregon. The women were residents of the Sassafras and Rainbow communes in nearby Newton County, Arkansas. Jamie told the women that he could give them a ride as far as Kansas City, and the duo were seen loading their belongings into his 1965 Ford camper van. No further information about the strange but true story of Jamie's mysterious disappearance has been released, and even though his remains have been identified, investigators continue to actively investigate this mystery case as a homicide. Anyone with missing information about the mystery of the Arkansas John Doe, Jamie Grow, is asked to contact Lieutenant Hunter Petrie at 479-271-1009. 40 years ago, Kathy Crossneck's life was tragically cut short when she was attacked in her own home. The scary mystery went unsolved for decades until the perpetrator finally faced justice in 2019. In this strange but true story, the man she trusted the most proved to be her ultimate downfall, and exactly why remains unknown. Kathy and James lived in a well-kept home on Del Rio Drive in Brighton, New York, with their 3.5-year-old daughter, Sarah. On the morning of February 19, 1982, James claimed that he left for work around 6:30 a.m. When he returned home that evening, he found Kathy had been struck in bed with an axe. Their daughter Sarah was unharmed, but had been home alone all day. There were signs of a robbery in the home, but police quickly determined that the scene was staged and nothing of value had been stolen. Investigators combed the entire home for clues, but were unable to find any evidence. At first, Kathy's shocked family stood by James, who appeared to be heartbroken and grieving with the loss of his wife. However, reports indicate that they grew suspicious over the years. In 2015, a new cold case unit further investigated the mystery using recent forensic investigation techniques. The axe, which came from the couple's garage, had been wiped down and was clean of any fingerprints. In addition, no foreign DNA or other evidence was found in the entire home, despite what had reportedly been thousands of hours of investigation. In an unexpected ending, investigators moved to convict James in 2019, despite the fact that no new criminal evidence had been uncovered. The prosecution's main argument was that the staged crime scene, as well as the lack of evidence that could incriminate anyone else, pointed to James as the likely culprit. The frightening mystery was solved when James was found guilty and sentenced to serve 25 years to life in 2022. After more than 30 years of going unsolved, a recently solved mystery made international headlines. In August of 1971, 21-month-old Melissa Highsmith was kidnapped in Fort Worth, Texas, sparking a national manhunt for the chubby-cheeked toddler. In 2022, thanks to forensic DNA testing, Melissa made headlines when she reunited with her mother, her father, and 2 of her 4 siblings in an unbelievable moment at the family's church, Her scary but true story shines as a beacon of hope to all of the families of missing individuals across the country. In 1971, Melissa's mother and father had recently separated, and her mother, Alta, was struggling to care for her daughter while holding down a full-time job to support herself. She placed an ad in a newspaper for a babysitter and agreed to meet a promising candidate at the restaurant where she worked. The woman was missing from the appointment and later called Alta apologetic. Although she was unable to come to the restaurant, she said she had a large backyard and cared for several other children. She was willing to pick Melissa up that afternoon. Desperate to keep her job, Alta agreed to let the woman pick her daughter up from her apartment, where her roommate was at home. Alta's roommate vetted the babysitter and said she seemed legitimate and was dressed to impress. Notably, she was wearing white gloves. The woman picked up Melissa and drove her away. She became a missing person case shortly after. Melissa's devastated family never stopped looking for her. Each November, they threw a birthday party for the young girl. They were active on Web Sleuths, an online discussion forum which covered Melissa's unsolved case, and they participated in countless newspaper and podcast interviews in order to keep her in the spotlight. More recently, they set up a Facebook page for the missing person. For more than 50 years, Alta gathered her family, including Melissa's 4 siblings, to release white balloons in honor of their missing sister. In 2022, Melissa's biological father, Jeffrey Highsmith, took the popular 23andMe home DNA test. When his results came back, they identified 3 grandchildren that Jeffrey did not know he had. The family worked with a genetic genealogist to determine that the children were likely Melissa's, and from there, they were able to find their missing daughter, still living in the Fort Worth area. Melissa, who was raised by the name Melanie, never knew that she had been kidnapped as a child. She struggled growing up and told reporters that she didn't have a happy life. Melissa said she didn't feel loved as a child, and she ran away as a teenager and lived on the streets. She's no longer in touch with the woman who raised her, and police have not confirmed if this woman was the kidnapper or otherwise involved in the scary mystery that had become Melissa's life. However, according to one of Melissa's sisters, the woman did make a confession that she knew that Melissa was a victim of criminal kidnapping. Melissa continues to reintegrate with her loving family, who are ecstatic to welcome her home. According to recent reports in the Washington Post, she plans to go by Melissa going forward, and even wants to renew her vows to her husband so that her father can walk her down the aisle. After 50 years, this scary solved mystery has come to an unbelievable but joyful resolution. In 1977, 43-year-old Richard Bishel was awoken by his son, and what followed would become a crime that remained an unsolved mystery for more than 40 years. At around 2:30 a.m. on the 16th of March of that year, 17-year-old Richard Bishel Jr. ran to his father's room in their house and told them that he had heard strange noises coming from the porch. Richard looked through a window and spotted a burglar casing the place. Both he and Richard Jr. ran out of the house and gave chase after the fleeing burglar. Richard Sr. soon overtook his son and disappeared around a corner, hot on the culprit's heels. But when his son finally caught up to him, he was shocked by what he had found. Richard had caught up to the man, but an altercation had broken out, resulting in Richard being attacked with a sharpened blade. The suspect had fled, and Richard was taken to a nearby hospital for treatment, but unfortunately, he passed away an hour later. Police immediately had a suspect, 23-year-old Richard Curley Bernard, who had by this point committed at least 100 burglaries. His house was searched and a jacket containing biological material was found. But since there was no way to identify who it belonged to, the case went cold. For the next 40 years, the unsolved case seemed destined to become just another scary moment in history, until 3 retired police officers who were part of the cold case unit decided to have the jacket tested for DNA evidence. The jacket was sent to a forensic laboratory in Richmond, and soon they had a result. The biological matter was found to belong to Richard, as was originally expected. But it was then discovered that Bernard had lost his life while committing another crime in Texas in 1989. The result was a bittersweet one, but investigators have stated that they, as well as Richard's family, are relieved to finally have the case solved, thanks to the diligent work of forensic experts. In 1968, 20-year-old Claire Josephs became a part of scary history in a case that would only be resolved with the help of forensic experts during a groundbreaking case. On the 7th of February, Bernard Josephs came home from work to find his wife, Claire, lying under their bed in their house, which was located in Bromley, England. She had been attacked with a serrated blade, and evidence on her hands showed that she had put up a fight. Investigators believed that Claire was attacked by someone she knew, since they found no sign of forced entry into the house, and Roger Payne, the husband of one of her friends, quickly became a suspect. Police searched his house and car, and they found biological material in the vehicle. They noticed that he had scratches on his hands, but he explained that he had gotten into a fight with his wife, and that she had scratched him during their altercation. When they took a closer look at some of his clothes, they found fibers in the seams and hems of items that had recently been laundered. Some of the same fibers were also found in his car, and they were sent away to be tested. When the results came back, it was found that the fibers matched those of a wool dress that Claire had been wearing at the time of the attack, and Payne was arrested. Payne, however, maintained his innocence and claimed that police officers had tampered with the evidence. But in a first for murder prosecutions in England, the forensic evidence proved to be enough for a conviction, and Payne was sentenced to life in prison. In 1991, while on an unescorted leave from jail, Payne fled to Bristol, where he changed his name to Thomas Fairfax. But it wasn't long before he was recognized, and a member of the public notified the police that Fairfax and Payne were the same person. Despite claiming that he was innocent and fighting to be paroled for many years, Payne finally accepted his fate in 2020, and now wishes to remain in prison for the rest of his life where he can be left alone. Today, fiber testing is still considered by experts to be one of the most important tools in forensic analysis, as it's contributed to the closure of many unsolved cases. The I-65 killer, also known as the Days Inn killer, became a part of creepy history in 1987 when 3 women lost their lives, and it wasn't until 2022 that a break in the case would lead to the culprit. In February of 1987, 41-year-old Vicky Heath was working the night shift at a Super 8 motel in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, where she was assaulted and attacked with a firearm. Her assailant then left her body next to trash cans located behind the motel where she was discovered. Then on the 3rd of March, 1989, 24-year-old Mary Gill, who worked as a night auditor at the Days Inn Motel in Merrillville, Indiana, was found deceased in the motel's parking lot by a passing motorist. Her life had also been taken with a firearm. On that same day, 34-year-old Jeanne Gilbert, a part-time auditor at the Remington Days Inn, lost her life after she was attacked with the same weapon. The attacker had robbed both motels and had fled with a total of $426. The following year, a 4th victim who was working the night shift at a Days Inn motel in Columbus, Indiana, was also attacked, but she managed to flee from her attacker, who she described as having greasy gray hair with a lazy green eye and a beard. Forensic evidence that was collected at the crime scenes included ballistic evidence, fibers, DNA, clothing, and hair. The ballistic and DNA evidence was helpful in linking the 4 cases, but it wouldn't be until decades later that the culprit was finally identified. Through a process known as investigative genealogy, where genetic relatives are identified and matched to a DNA sample, a man called Harry Edward Greenwell was identified as the killer. He was found to have extensive criminal records, and he had escaped from prison on 2 occasions. The 4 crimes had finally been solved, but investigators believed that Greenwell may have been responsible for a number of other crimes, none of which could be proven since he passed away in January of 2013 while living in Iowa. When Greenwell's wife was contacted and informed that he'd been implicated in the now solved cases, She told investigators that she knew he had a criminal past, but was unaware that it included ending the lives of at least 4 women. On the 10th of June, 1971, Raymond Shublin, the president of Lexington Trust Bank in Bedford, Massachusetts, came home from work and stumbled upon a scene that would remain an unsolved mystery for almost 3 decades. On that day, Raymond noticed that his wife, Natalie's car, a blue and white 1969 Chevy Impala, wasn't in the driveway, and as he searched their house, he couldn't find her either. That is, until he checked the basement, where he found her deceased. Her ankles had been bound together, and a makeshift gag had been placed around her neck. She had been attacked with a blade, and a heavy object had been used to end her life. As police searched the area, Natalie's vehicle was found abandoned less than half a mile from the house at the VA hospital. Investigators found that the car had been wiped clean, but a few latent fingerprints were found on the rear window of the passenger side. But due to a lack of fingerprint technology, a culprit could not be identified unless the print was already on file, which it wasn't. However, in July of 1999, the FBI launched their Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, known as IAFIS. It had been loaded with 40,000 fingerprints, and Arthur Macy was identified as a suspect. Macy was interviewed by police, but he denied ever having been in Bedford and stated that he had been approached by an organized crime syndicate who asked him to end the life of a banker's wife and to make it look like a botched robbery, but he claimed that he turned the offer down. When the prints were analyzed more closely, they were found to be a match to Macy's left thumb. Added to that evidence, a woman came forward to say that she had worked with Macy in the past and that he had bragged about using a blade to end someone's life. This gave investigators the proof they needed, and Macy was finally arrested in Salem in 2022. Now 76 years old, Macy pleaded not guilty to the charge, and his trial is currently ongoing at the Massachusetts Superior Court in Boston. The unsolved mystery of the murder of an unknown woman has finally been solved more than 30 years after the fact, thanks to the work done by forensic experts. The case started on the 5th of November, 1980, when the remains of a woman were found in a wooded area near Gardner, off of Louisiana Highway 28 West. A local man had been hunting rabbits with his 2 beagles when the dogs began baying. At first, he thought the dogs had spotted a rabbit, but when he went to investigate, he found a skull together with socks and some hair. The new evidence was sent to Louisiana State University's repository for missing and unidentified persons, known as the Faces Lab, and here it was determined that the remains belonged to a woman and that she had lost her life at least 2 months before being found. The lab was able to create a facial reconstruction of the victim, and a photo was posted to various websites and social media sites. But years went by without any new leads until 2014, when there was finally a lead in the unsolved case. A woman from Pineville contacted investigators and notified them that she recognized the woman in the photograph, which she saw on the Help ID Me Facebook page. She stated that the woman was, in fact, 18-year-old Donna Gale Brazel, who was her granddaughter and who had been living in the Alexandria-Pineville area at the time that she went missing. Investigators collected DNA samples from the woman, and they were sent away for analysis. The samples were a match, and Donna had finally been identified. Then in 2014, 56-year-old Gary Heyman, who was serving a 49-year sentence for second-degree kidnapping, first-degree robbery, and public bribery, came forward and told police that a man named Leo Laird was responsible for ending Donna's life. Laird was tracked down and arrested in August of 2019, and in February of 2020, both he and Heyman were charged. In 2021, Laird's defense attorney claimed that Heyman wasn't a credible witness, and that he had a history of making false allegations against Laird and his family. He produced court documents from Allen Parish where Heyman's credibility was also questioned. He also presented documents showing that Heyman had homicidal tendencies, and that he had reported hearing a voice in his head that called his name. The case continues. Before she went missing on April 20th of 1990, Patricia Lee Whaley told people she was going to a doctor's appointment in Lodi, about an hour's drive from her home in Angel Camp, California. Later that evening, she called a neighbor to tell her husband George that she would not be missing for long. Why Patricia did not call George directly is an unsolved mystery that could have something to do with her mysterious disappearance. After that night in April, Patricia would vanish without a trace, never to be found again. Her Chevrolet van was found in a parking lot on May 2nd of 1990, still abandoned where a witness reported it 2 weeks ago. The unsolved missing person case went cold for more than 15 years later, until 2006, when the Office of District Attorney John Crawford developed a new digital database to track Social Security numbers and their use. This database determined possible criminal activity in Colorado where someone had been using Patricia's Social Security number. The criminal suspect had used several different false names, including Patricia Whaley. In a strange but true twist, when the perpetrator was interviewed by Colorado police, she wasn't a criminal, but rather Patricia herself. The missing person told investigators that she had intentionally made the strange decision to mysteriously disappear in 1990, leaving her husband and children behind. She said that she'd been having personal problems, including depression, and the case was solved after she admitted to boarding a Greyhound bus from Lodi, California to Colorado. Unlike most missing person cases, detectives were specifically asked by her not to reveal the true story behind her whereabouts, as she didn't want to speak to her ex-husband or children. According to crime investigators, she's beyond the statute of limitations for child abandonment, and therefore cannot be prosecuted with a crime. Her strange disappearance is considered solved, although sadly her family may never have any explanation from it. The strange disappearance of Angela Brummond, though solved, is a missing person case that still fails to bring a satisfying resolution to her family over 25 years later. In 1980, 4-year-old Angela was abducted from her home in Sioux City, Nebraska by her grandmother, Sharon Brummond. Authorities quickly ascertained what had happened, but for reasons unknown, a missing person report was not filed until 1983. By this time, Angela and Sharon had traveled someplace far before mysteriously vanishing to an unknown destination. As enforcement in Nebraska worked hard to solve what had happened to Angela, FBI special agents also assisted with case files more than a foot thick. Sometime in the 1980s, Florida police got a tip of a missing person sighting at a local Hardee's, but the grandmother and child slipped out the back door before investigators arrived. They likely relocated to another state at this time, and Sharon may have homeschooled Angela to keep her name out of public records. In 2004, well over a decade later, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reissued a warrant for Sharon's arrest, which drew national attention to Angela's unsolved case. FBI agents and the U.S. Attorney's Office spoke with legal representatives for Angela, now an adult, and for Sharon. An agreement was reached and Sharon was brought into court to be arrested in June of 2006. The true crime story came to an end when Sharon was sentenced to 3 years probation in Florida, where she had secretly kept Angela a missing person for decades. Although she appeared at her grandmother's criminal trial, Angela did not speak on the stand or with the press. To this day, she still has chosen not to speak to the press, and many questions remain unanswered, including what Sharon told Angela and other people for all the years that she was missing. However, the Sioux City Journal did report that Angela met with her estranged mother and father shortly after her missing person case was closed. She still lives in Jacksonville. Whether or not she's been able to reconnect with the missing people in her life remains a strange mystery. Nadia Alexandra DeBog was once a missing person who mysteriously disappeared after being taken by a trusted adult. Unlike many other cases, however, this strange but true crime story of a missing girl found safe years later spans the entire world. Nadia DeBog was born in 1990 to parents Maureen and Mohammed. Before her daughter went missing, Maureen filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable religious differences. In 1992, Maureen left the family's Ohio home with Nadia and then filed for divorce and custody, which was still being finalized when she disappeared. Mohammed had once told Maureen he wanted to move the family to his native home of Syria, and she was terrified about leaving her daughter with him. Tragically, her worst fears came true when he mysteriously disappeared with Nadia sometime in 1992 or early 93. In October of 1995, Maureen traveled to Syria to secure custody of Nadia in the Syrian courts. She now had the full government support of both the US and Syria. She hoped to have her missing daughter found after searching in Saudi Arabia in 1995 and again in 1996, but the case remains unsolved. For the next several years, she spent nearly $250,000 on an international search effort to find out what happened to Nadia. By the 1990s, the strange disappearance still remained unsolved, and Maureen had bitterly grown more focused on seeking revenge. As she sat near a house in Syria where she believed Nadia was living, she realized her missing daughter would not even know who she was and might not even speak English anymore. Maureen would be taking her away from what she thought was home, essentially causing more harm than good. From then on out, Maureen focused on building a relationship with her ex and learning about multicultural conflicts and mediation. Although she continued her search for Nadia, she hoped that Mohammed might be willing to reunite her with her daughter himself. Then, in the middle of the night in April of 2010, her phone rang. Her ex-husband was calling, and a 20-year-old Nadia was on the line. Mohammed told Maureen that Nadia was now an adult and had the right to speak to her mother if she wished. From there, the two slowly built a relationship. Maureen has told reporters that things were awkward at first because by that point, her daughter had been so reshaped by her environment that they had nothing in common but their shared DNA. They grew close over time, and in August of 2010, Maureen flew to Damascus, Syria to see her daughter in person. Since then, the two have remained in regular contact. Due to the volatile situation in Syria, Nadia and her father have made the decision for her safety not to speak directly to the press, and coverage of the story since the reunion over 10 years ago has been extremely limited. Maureen also uses a different name in her personal life. However, she told reporters in 2012 that her familiar relationship with Nadia is growing, and she hopes that her daughter, who's an American citizen, will visit the United States one day. In 2011, police found a hitchhiker just outside of Laramie, Wisconsin, who was later identified as a missing person who had not returned home for more than 3 years. He was extradited to New York, where he was set to be tried and sentenced for up to 15 years. The crime of hitchhiking was not to blame. Rather, this true crime story can be explained by examining the strange disappearance of Edward Allen Christensen years prior. Edward was a respected and affluent lawyer on Long Island, New York. On November 7, 2007, he represented the owner of a property in Suffolk County over a dispute. The plaintiff and defendant both agreed to hold a total of $1 million in a special account while they sorted out the agreement. Edward Christensen would look after that account until they reached an agreement. As the case grew larger, there were also $28,000 to $47,000 made into this account between October 1, 2007 and April 4 of 2008. He was supposed to be the person watching the funds, but money began to go missing. For approximately 10 months, he siphoned $211,000 for his own leisure and bills. Then on October 17, 2009, Edward vanished without a trace. A missing person report was not filed by his wife for some time. While trying to solve this disappearance, investigators accidentally stumbled onto evidence of Edward's criminal embezzlement. In November of 2009, a warrant was issued for his arrest. But years later, what happened to Edward remained a mystery. That fateful fall afternoon in Laramie, Wisconsin, was when Edward was found attempting to hitchhike along the side of the highway, where he was extradited and held accountable for his crimes, thus bringing this strange case of the missing hiker to an unexpected ending. Perhaps one of the lengthier solved missing person cases in US history is that of Catherine Dyer, who was listed as a missing person in 1954 and not found until 2009. This unexplained disappearance was ultimately solved by a simple, if morbid, case of missing identity. When Catherine's case was reopened in the 21st century, she was believed to be a Jane Doe body that was found on the banks of the Boulder Creek in April of 1954. It was only due to the Jane Doe investigation that Catherine was found alive and well in Australia. Before she became a missing person, Catherine had a short marriage with a man named Jimmy Dyer that ended in 1953, after which she went to a boarding house for single women in Denver, Colorado. On March 26, 1954, her mysterious disappearance was reported, and then went cold. Her case would have likely remained unsolved had investigators not made the connection between her disappearance and the tragic discovery of a Jane Doe just a few days later. On April 8th, the missing body of a young woman with strawberry blonde hair was found on the banks of Boulder Creek. The woman had no identifying marks and no dental work, just an appendectomy scar and 3 bobby pins in her hair. The Jane Doe was not formally connected with Catherine's case for decades until 2004, when the Jane Doe's case was reopened and Catherine was considered as a possible match. A forensic reconstruction based on the Jane Doe's bone structure looked strikingly similar to a photo of Catherine. When superimposed, the forensic investigation revealed the 2 photos were a potential match, and investigators began to dig into Catherine's case more closely. One of the photographs used in the investigation was provided by a local historian named Sylvia Pettum, who was drawn to the unsolved case and was sure Catherine was the missing woman. She published a number of theories online, none of which were correct, but in a truly unexpected ending did help get her missing person case inadvertently solved. All the way in Australia, a senior caretaker had found some old papers in the house of an elderly woman she'd been watching. In these papers was an address book with the name Catherine Dyer. When the caretaker searched the name out of curiosity, she found Sylvia's theory on Catherine. Much to her surprise, when she looked at the photos on the website, she realized Catherine was none other than the elderly woman she'd been watching over, Barbara. Using other names in the address book, she contacted other people who used to know Barbara and found out her family, who was not close, knew her as Emily. Her sister verified that she'd moved to Australia around the same time that Barbara lived in Australia, since 1963. The missing person was eventually found residing in an Australian nursing home in 2010. In 2009, 1 year before the mysterious disappearance of Barbara was solved, the Jane Doe case was solved as well. The results of forensic DNA testing found the missing body belonged to a Phoenix, Arizona-based woman named Dorothy Gay Howard, who went missing in the fall of 1953. In 2020, a homeless man confessed to a crime that had remained unsolved for almost 40 years. With few leads to go on, police had closed the case in 1985, but were finally able to bring justice to the victim. It was 1983 when Christopher Ainscought's body was found in his flat in northwest London. Police had gone to check on him after he failed to show up for work. Blunt force attacks had caused his passing, and police believed a marble ashtray that was found in the flat was one of the weapons used. The crime scene was described as brutal. There was little evidence found at the flat. There were no fingerprints, but police did collect a cigarette butt in one of the ashtrays in case there was any evidence they could use. 2 years later, when no further leads had turned up, and not even a next of kin could be found, the case was closed. That was until 2020. Anthony Kemp had lived a violent criminal life. In 1980, he was arrested for owning an illegal weapon, and spent much of his life in and out of prison on burglary convictions. He had also previously used illegal substances. At the age of 59, faced with becoming homeless, Kemp finally decided to confess to a crime he'd kept a secret for 37 years. He had met Christopher at a bar Christopher had been warned by friends not to invite strangers to his home so often, but he didn't listen to this advice and brought Kemp back to his flat. There they had an argument, though Kemp claimed that he couldn't remember what it was about and Kemp attacked him. After he had taken Christopher's life, he wiped down all the surfaces he had touched and fled the scene. Now he was confessing because he decided he would rather spend the rest of his life in prison than remain homeless. But for some reason, Kemp then retracted his confession. He instead blamed the crime on one of his accomplices from a robbery in the 1980s. This accomplice had already passed away in prison, but DNA testing on the cigarette left at the scene of the crime confirmed that it had been Kemp, not his accomplice, who had been there. After this, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Sometime in late 1960, Peter Rain Bart made his wife disappear. 20 years later, her disappearance remains unsolved, and Rain Bart thought he'd gotten away with his crime. Even when his lover went to the police, nothing was done. Then workers at a peat plant made a gruesome discovery. Rain Bart met Malika Maria de Fernandez in 1959. She was a portrait artist who loved traveling. He was an airline executive who'd been trying to hide his homosexuality. At the time, homosexuality was still against the law and would be for years. Within hours of meeting, Rain Bart proposed. A few days later, the two were married. Unsurprisingly, it was a loveless marriage. They spent a few months together in Manchester, where they rented a home. After a few short months, Malika returned to traveling, and Rain Bart moved into a cottage with a male lover. The cottage was on the outskirts of the small town of Wimslow and was surrounded by a peat bog. In late 1960, Malika returned. According to Rain Bart, she wanted more money and threatened to expose his sexuality if she didn't get it. Rain Bart flew into a rage and took Malika's life. He tried to burn her remains, but for some reason that didn't work. So instead, he scattered them in the bog. For years, Rain Bart got on with his life. Police suspected that he was responsible for his wife's disappearance and dug up his garden in search of a body, but nothing turned up. Rain Bart would leave the area and was involved in other crimes. One of his accomplices told police Rain Bart had confessed to taking Malika's life. Rain Bart was brought in for questioning but denied it, and the matter went no further. He had not long been released from prison for an unrelated crime when human remains were found in the bog in May of 1983. Ever since the 15th century, the bog around Wilmslow had been the site of peat harvesting for fuel and fertilizer. After the Industrial Revolution, it was automated, but workers were on the site to make sure nothing that could damage the machinery was used. It was these workers that found what they thought was a ball. After cleaning it up, they were horrified to find it was actually the partially preserved remains of a skull. Police were called and immediately believed the remains belonged to Malika. Finally, Rain Bart confessed to the crime he had thought he'd gotten away with. But there was another twist to the story. The skull was sent to Oxford University for analysis. They discovered that the woman it had belonged to had actually lived almost 2,000 years earlier. Realizing this wasn't Malika, Rain Bart tried to retract his confession, but he was still found guilty for the crime. Malika's body has never been found. The following year, more remains were discovered, but these belonged to a man who had also lived in Roman Britain. His passing was also the result of a crime, but one that took place hundreds of years ago. For 22 years, the end of Elaine Graham's life was an unsolved crime. It wasn't until 2003 that cold case detectives finally solved the crime. Elaine was 29 years old when she disappeared in March of 1983. She was a part-time nurse studying at California State University. She was married to a doctor, and together they had a 2-year-old daughter. The morning of March 17th started off completely normal. Elaine dropped off her daughter with the babysitter and went to university. This was the last that anyone saw or heard from her. Elaine was soon reported missing, and even before her body was found, police had a suspect. Elaine's body was found 8 months later by hikers in the Browns Canyon. The discovery brought more circumstantial evidence against the suspect, but it wasn't enough to prosecute. Without any additional evidence, the case went cold. The criminal walked free for more than 20 years. When cold case detectives reopened the case, the first step was to look at the original suspect. Edmund J. Marr had been in his early 20s at the time of the crime. He went into the Army, following in the steps of his father, who had passed away when he was a child. On the 21st anniversary of his father's passing, Marr was kicked out of the Army for using illegal substances. Marr did not react well. The following day, he crossed paths with Elaine at the university. Marr abducted her and took her life. At first, Marr was suspected because he'd been at the university around the time of the disappearance, and near where the car was found the following day. Then he was arrested for a robbery and a bladed weapon was found. After Elaine's body was discovered, it emerged that she'd been attacked with a similar weapon. Unfortunately, DNA testing wasn't good enough to determine if this was the exact blade used in the attack. When the case was reopened, DNA was retested. It found Elaine's DNA was on Marr's weapon. New witnesses also came forward. Marr was arrested again, and this time he pleaded guilty to the crime. In 2003, he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Why he chose to commit such a terrible crime has never been revealed, but at least the criminal faced justice after decades. In 1998, Falls Township had an unsolved crime that they were desperate to see solved. What was once thought to be a robbery gone wrong was discovered to be something much darker. On the morning of February 4th, 1984, the day manager of a Roy Roger restaurant in Philadelphia walked into a crime scene. Terry Brooks, the night manager, had been attacked in an extremely violent manner. The safe had been tampered with, and the takings from the day were missing. Police believed the crime was a robbery gone wrong. They found fingerprints and DNA under Terry's fingernails, but none of the evidence matched anything on record. From what police could make out, there hadn't been anything unusual seen the previous day. Terry had stayed behind to do paperwork. The other employees left at 1 a.m. Terry locked the door, then called her fiancé. Then the robbery happened. The case went cold, and 14 years later, it was brought to the Vidic Society. Here, detectives didn't think the case was a robbery. The attack looked too much to be the work of someone who wasn't only there for money, and they believed the attack was personal. They also believed Terry likely knew her attacker. There was no sign of forced entry, meaning she'd let them in herself. All evidence had pointed to a boyfriend. After talking to Terry's parents and looking at the funeral register, they found the name of the fiancé, Alfred Scott Keefe. Keefe had moved to nearby Warminster by this point. Police were able to get the address because he'd recently been arrested for driving under the influence. But Keefe fitting the profile wasn't enough to arrest him. Police collected trash from Keefe's home and found cigarette butts. They were the same brand that Keefe had had with him during the driving offense. They tested the saliva on the butts, and police confirmed that they'd been smoked by the same person, who had taken Terry's life years earlier. After eliminating Keefe's brother as a suspect, Keefe was arrested. During interrogation, he confessed, and in 2000, he was handed a life sentence. In November of 1986, an elderly Oklahoma couple hired divers to search Claremore Lake for an antique car that had been pushed into the water decades earlier. What divers found instead, under 11 feet of water, was a body. The person had significant damage to their head. making identification through dental records impossible, and they'd been underwater too long to be recognizable. But what police did have was a theory for who this mysterious John Doe was. In July, Frank Ross had failed to show up for work at his brother's grocery store in Stillwell. He had just traveled to Claremore to visit family. His family reported him missing on July 31st and had spent the last few months searching for him. With no way of identifying the body, it was buried as a John Doe. Years later, as DNA testing improved, a new witness came forward, and the case was finally solved. The first step came in 1992. A woman who'd been dating a man named James Kent Hill told police that Hill had confessed to taking Ross's life. On the night Ross disappeared, he'd come home upset and scared, and with a red substance on his clothing. He told her that he'd met a man at the bar and for some reason offered him a life somewhere. In the car, Ross had supposedly made a romantic pass at Hill. Hill had pulled over and violently attacked him with a rock and a bladed weapon. He'd specifically tried to make it harder for the body to be identified. He then weighed it down and dumped it in Claremore Lake. The body was exhumed and new DNA testing was used, comparing the remains with Ross's mother. The technique was so new, Oklahoma courts weren't even certain it was able to be used as evidence. But the testing did confirm the body belonged to Ross. With an almost 10-year-old disappearance solved, the family was now appealing for witnesses to help solve the crime. In 1995, police finally had enough evidence to arrest Hill. He eventually confessed and was convicted for the now solved crime. On February 1st, 1922, famous Hollywood film director William Desmond Taylor was found deceased in his home in the stylish, up-and-coming neighborhood in Westlake, Los Angeles. William was a part of the budding Hollywood film industry and worked with many famous actors and actresses to create some of the first big-screen films. William was well-respected both within his local community and his profession, so his untimely passing was a shock to everyone. Once the police were able to clear out the crowds of people who had flocked to his house to take a look at the scene, they transported his body to the mortuary for an autopsy. According to reports, a person at the initial scene identified themselves as a doctor and declared that William had passed due to a stomach hemorrhage. It's unknown as to whether this person was really a doctor, as investigators failed to track them down. The autopsy revealed that William had been shot at least once, leading to his demise. When this update hit the streets of California, the media circus only intensified. Who could be capable of such a thing? And more importantly, why? In the months following the event, the media continued to run with wild stories and began circling in on suspects. Numerous suspects were named and reputations were ruined. But because there was no physical evidence, the police were unable to make any arrests. The case of William Desmond Taylor ran cold. That was until 1964, when an unlikely suspect made a startling confession. Margaret Gibson, known in Hollywood as Pat Lewis, called for a priest to be at her bedside as she was in her last moments of life. She turned to the priest and confessed that she was the one responsible for what happened to William Desmond Taylor all those years ago. She never gave a reason as to why she had done it, and passed away before more information could be ascertained. Margaret Gibson had worked with William in the Hollywood film industry, but in 1922, she wasn't named as a suspect and was quickly forgotten about. There's no physical evidence tying Margaret to the crime, but with her confession, it makes it hard to doubt that she may have somehow been involved. On August 9, 2008, a heavily pregnant Nili Shamrat walked into an antique store in Tel Aviv, Israel, and presented the shop owner with a find of a lifetime. The woman before him asked for his valuation opinion, as she was wanting to get the items insured, and as he pulled the treasures out of the box, he almost fainted. In his hands, he was holding a watch made for the infamous Marie Antoinette. The store owner knew the value of this item and knew that the creator of the watch was regarded as the watchmaker of kings and the king of watchmakers. Throughout his time, his craft was sought out by those in the highest positions of power, and owning one of his pieces brought the owner some serious clout. There was one detail that puzzled the owner though. 25 years ago, in 1983, that very same watch that he was holding in his hands had been stolen from a museum in Jerusalem. So how had a heavily pregnant woman come into possession of these great historical pieces? The store owner immediately reported the woman to the police, and investigators were able to track her down and search her home. When Neely's house was raided by police, they found 96 of 106 items that had been stolen from the museum back in 1983. These items weren't just monetarily valuable, but also historically valuable. Investigators sat Neely down and asked her to explain just how she had gotten a hold of all these items. She sighed and eventually told investigators everything they wanted to know. She'd been married to a man who was known throughout Tel Aviv as a burglar. On a cool April night in 1983, working completely alone, he drove to the back gates of the museum and pulled off one of the biggest heists in Israel's history. He left behind little physical evidence, and due to the scope of his crime, the authorities believed that it was the work of an organized crime unit. For decades, the case remained unsolved, and the museum offered a reward for anyone who could help them find the items. It wasn't until Neely Shamrod walked into the shop that day that the mystery was finally solved. She told investigators that shortly before his passing, her husband took her to the museum and showed her where his infamous heist had taken place. He also gave her the locations of the missing treasures that were placed around his apartment and held in storage facilities. She told the authorities that she was trying to do the right thing and return the items to the museum, but was charged with receiving and dealing with stolen goods. In 2009, convicted prisoner James Washington lay in his hospital bed after suffering from a heart attack. Washington feared that the end was near for him and summoned a prison guard, James Tomlinson, over to his bed to make one last confession. Tomlinson leaned down over Washington's bed and listened as he spoke. Washington told him that he was responsible for the 1995 crime against 35-year-old Joyce Goodner. Joyce had been found in Nashville in an abandoned house with various injuries to her body. Washington had then started a fire at an abandoned lot, hoping to cover his tracks, but firefighters were alerted and rushed to the scene. Inside, they discovered Joyce's body, and since that fateful day in 1995, investigators worked tirelessly to crack her case. They never would have expected that a deathbed confession, or at least what Washington thought was going to be his deathbed, would finally lead them to solve the case. According to sources, Washington had been considered a suspect for many years, but due to a lack of evidence or a confession, they were unable to bring him to trial. Investigators had finally solved the case, but believed that Washington would never face justice for what he did. That was until his condition was stabilized and he survived. He was once again brought before the courts where he recanted his original confession. Susan Niland told NBC, quote, "He did take the confession back, and during those closing arguments at the trial, there was an indication that he was hallucinating. The defense presented proof earlier in the trial as to what effect the medications he was taking were having on him." Despite Washington recanting his deathbed confession, the court found him guilty in 1995 in the case of Joyce Goodner. For his crime, Washington was ordered to serve life in prison with a minimum of 51 years, ensuring that he'll never make it out of prison alive. James Brewer was seen as an upstanding member of his local community in Oklahoma. He went to church every weekend and worked at a local factory, providing for his family as his children grew up and flourished into adults. In 2009, Brewer was suffering from ill health, and after he suffered from a stroke, he lay in his bed thinking that his time of reckoning had finally arrived. Believing that this was it, Brewer instructed his wife to call the police and ask them to come to the hospital and be at his bedside as he had something to confess. When the officers arrived, he told them that he wanted to cleanse his soul and confessed to being responsible for the crime against Jimmy Carroll that he'd been suspected of in 1977. In '77, Brewer was arrested in Tennessee when police believed he was involved in the passing of a man who had tried to seduce Brewer's wife. Somehow, Brewer dodged bail and ran to Oklahoma with his wife. They both vowed to never speak of the incident again and started a new life under new identities. Incredibly, Brewer survived and his condition was stabilized. He was taken into custody by police in Tennessee to answer for his crimes. Those who knew the couple as Michael and Dorothy Anderson in Oklahoma were shocked. They were a good family, and many people found it hard to believe that they would be capable of such an act. It isn't clear whether James Brewer actually faced prison time, although articles speculate that he was looking at a sentence of capital punishment. As far as Geraldine Kelly's children knew, their father had passed away as a result of a car accident in 1990. Geraldine even told her family the same story, with her sister Tammy DiMarzio telling NBC News, quote, "She told me he had took off in the car and last she heard he had been in an accident, that he was hit by a truck or something." But this was all a lie. For 14 years, Geraldine kept the truth hidden. That was until November of 2004. In November, 54-year-old Geraldine was in the late stages of her battle with cancer, as she knew she didn't have much longer on this earth. In an attempt to set the record straight, she summoned her daughter to her bedside and told her the truth of what had really happened to her father. She pulled her daughter in close and confessed that he hadn't taken off in the car and simply been involved in an accident. Rather, she had been the one responsible for his demise. She told her daughter that her father had treated her badly, and this was an act of self-defense rather than revenge. At the time of John Kelly's passing, the family lived in California, and after he mysteriously disappeared, Geraldine packed up her children and moved to Massachusetts for a fresh start. John's children often thought about him, but believed their mother's story and never pursued the matter further. Geraldine's startling confession blew the case open, and now not only were they dealing with the loss of their mother, but they were trying to comprehend what had happened to their father. Geraldine also confessed that John's body could be found in the Planet Self-Storage Facility in Somerville, and sure enough, when investigators visited the facility, they found his remains. Geraldine had placed John inside of an unplugged freezer and sealed it with duct tape. She had even shipped the freezer to Massachusetts when she moved. Geraldine passed away soon after her confession, and while no criminal charges were brought against her, her children and John's family now have some answers. In 2012, a robbery that took place in the German town of Schwelm left investigators baffled as they were unable to find a suspect. It became a cold case until a break finally resulted in the case being solved more than 9 years later. The robbery took place in March of that year, and when the police force investigated, they found very few leads. They did, however, discover that the perpetrator had taken a bite out of a sausage that had been left out. The sausage was taken as evidence, and forensic investigators were able to collect a small amount of DNA that belonged to the robber. The sample was entered into an international database, but with no results and with no further evidence or witnesses, the case went cold. Then in 2021, an Albanian man living in France was arrested on charges of a violent crime that he had committed there. His DNA was taken and entered into the same database by French police, and to their surprise, it came back as a match with the DNA taken from the sausage. Police in Germany were immediately notified via the database, and after nearly a decade, the robber had been identified. But luck was on his side. The statute of limitations had already expired for the robbery, and hence he was not extradited back to Germany. The man has not been charged for the crime, and will not face any additional charges for his earlier crimes. Real estate attorney Royal Daniel III, also known as Scoop, attained his law degree from the University of Virginia, and he became a respected member of his community, who often offered pro bono work to people who applied for green cards, and he was an active member of his church. On the 26th of April, 2007, Daniel had attended a fundraiser in his hometown of Breckenridge in Colorado, and fellow guests stated that nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and that he wasn't acting out of character in any way. The following day, one of Daniel's co-workers at the Daniel law firm arrived at the office and found that he wasn't there. A pot of coffee was left brewing and Daniel's dog was inside the building, but there was no trace of him. Inside his office, he found an empty cereal bowl on his desk, and a pair of broken sunglasses were found on the floor next to a pen. When he'd missed 2 appointments by 3 p.m., his coworkers became concerned and they filed a missing person report. At 7:48 that evening, a 911 call was made from Daniel's phone, but when the dispatcher answered, there was only silence on the line. When his cell phone was pinged, it was found to be near a tower located close to his office. Daniel's apartment was searched by police, but they found no evidence that a crime had been committed, though his motorbike and passport were missing. Surveillance cameras from the professional building on Ski Hill Road showed Daniel arriving at 5:35 a.m., but he was never seen leaving and it turned into a cold case. On the 8th of May, 2007, police issued an arrest warrant for Daniel when it was discovered that he had embezzled over $900,000 from clients that had been paid to him for real estate transactions. It was found that he had a large amount of debt at the time that he went missing, and that he had been using the money in an attempt to rescue his failing business. 17 days later, he was suspended from practicing law in Colorado. More than 4 years later, Daniel attempted to cross into California from Mexico while using his real passport. This triggered the warrant that had been issued, and he was taken into custody by U.S. Border Patrol agents. He was taken to the San Diego Central Jail, and he awaited extradition back to Colorado, where he would be facing 8 charges of felony theft and 5 charges of commercial bribery. He told investigators that on the day of his disappearance, he'd planned on ending his own life on Hoosier Pass, and that he had taken his passport with him so that his body could be identified. He phoned 911 for help, but ended the call after changing his mind. For 4 years, he lived in Acapulco as a hermit, unaware that he was being sought by police. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony theft, and was sentenced to serve 12 years in prison and pay a total of $462,000 to his victims as restitution. On the 4th of June, 1972, the body of 48-year-old Arlene Clevezy was found in a wooded area located close to Humebrook in Newton, New Hampshire. Investigators learned that she was last seen that morning in the company of a man named Albert Francis Moore Jr. The previous evening, they were having drinks at a club in Haverhill, about 20 minutes from the spot where her remains were found, and they were seen leaving there together. Witnesses at the club described Moore as being very intoxicated, and had at one point become violent to the point where he aimed a firearm at someone. Throughout the next few years, Moore admitted to several people that he was responsible for Arlene's passing, and bragged that he had beaten a polygraph test when he was questioned about the crime. In April of 1977, police accused Moore of having committed the crime, But prosecutors decided not to pursue the charges, as he was already serving a life sentence for causing the demise of Donald Rimmer in Salem, Massachusetts in 1972. When Moore was interviewed again in 2015, he denied responsibility for both of the crimes and stated that he had no memory of Arlene's case, and couldn't say for certain whether or not he was involved. When he was asked if he could merely have forgotten, he replied that anything is possible. When the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit reopened the case in 2015, they interviewed the relevant witnesses again and confirmed that the statements they made at the time were correct. This included descriptions of the crime scene, the actions of both Arlene and Moore that night, and the admissions that Moore had made. This led them to the conclusion that Moore was indeed responsible for Arlene's passing, but they were unable to charge him as he'd passed away in November of 2019. But they were finally able to close Arlene's case. In 1960, Irene Garza worked as a second-grade school teacher in McAllen, Texas. She was the secretary of the school's Parent-Teacher Association, and although she was very shy, she'd started to feel more confident in her abilities. On the 16th of April, she told her parents that she was going to confession at the Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, and several people remembered seeing her there that evening. When she didn't return home that night, her parents assumed that she had stayed at the church for midnight mass, but when she still was not home by 3 a.m., they reported her as a missing person to the McAllen Police Department. 2 days later, several of her belongings, including her purse, left shoe, and her veil were found over an area of several hundred yards on a road in the city, and a search was conducted that became the biggest in the history of the Rio Grande Valley at the time. Her parents received a call from a woman claiming to be Irene, stating that she'd been abducted and taken to a hotel in Hidalgo, but it was found that she wasn't the one who had placed the call. On the 21st of April, Irene's body was discovered in a canal, miles away from the area where her belongings were found. Nearly 500 people were questioned, including her coworkers and ex-boyfriends, but to no avail, and a $2,500 reward was offered for any information on the case, with a Texas businessman also offering a $10,000 reward. Father John Fite came under suspicion when parishioners told police that he'd been away from confession on several occasions on the night that Irene went missing. When Irene was found in the canal, police also found Fite's photo slide viewer, and he was asked to take a polygraph test, which he passed, though it was later revealed that the results were inconclusive, and it became a cold case. 45 years later, in 2015, District Attorney Ricardo Rodriguez took a renewed interest in the case, and in February of 2016, Fite was arrested in Arizona at the age of 83. He was extradited to Texas and held on a $1 million bond. At his trial, the prosecution asked that he be sentenced to 57 years in prison, the same number of years that had passed in the case, but he was ultimately sentenced to a life term. He would pass away years later due to natural causes. In 1968, 22-year-old art student Wendy Jo Hallison phoned her sister Linda and told her that she'd seen an ad in the Sunday newspaper for hair dryers that were on sale at a store called Thrifty in their hometown of Los Angeles. She asked if Linda wanted to go with her to the store to buy one, but her sister declined as she wanted to spend the day with her husband and her 2 young sons. Wendy decided to go anyway, and she drove to the store on the corner of Wilshire Boulevard. Later on that day, she was seen buying gas at a nearby gas station, but she never returned home, and her family reported her as missing, but they were told by police that it was too soon to file a report. Private investigator Gil Court hired a helicopter to aid in the search, and the following morning, her car was spotted from the air a few blocks away by her boyfriend. He found her car keys on the floor in the back of the car. He opened the trunk and found Wendy inside. She was still wearing all of her jewelry, and police ruled out robbery as a motive. They focused their investigation on her boyfriend, as it had seemed unlikely that he could spot her car from the air, a theory that the pilot of the helicopter supported. He was asked to take a lie detector test, which he failed, but police found no further evidence and no one was charged with the crime, causing it to become a cold case. 30 years later, as DNA analysis was emerging, police found biological material on Wendy's clothes, and they were able to create a DNA profile. Wendy's then boyfriend was asked to submit a sample, and it didn't match, and he was cleared as a suspect once again. The case came to a halt. But in 2015, the DNA was run through their database again, and this time it matched a man named Edwin Richardson. It was found that he had a long history with the law and was in fact a serial killer, but he unfortunately passed away before he could be held accountable for Wendy's passing. In July of 2020, an unnamed Tesla staffer received a WhatsApp message from an old friend. Igor Kryuchkov. Kryuchkov was a Russian national who had known the staffer since 2016, but they hadn't spoken for a while. They began chatting again, and when Kryuchkov came to America on a tourist visa in August, they met up again. Kryuchkov took the staffer to fancy restaurants and picked up the tab, but made sure not to be caught in any photos. After a couple of days together, he took the staffer to a bar in Reno, where he made an interesting proposition. Kryuchkov would pay $500,000 to have a piece of malware placed on Tesla's network. This could either be done with a USB stick or by opening a malicious email on the staffer's work computer. Once the malware was on the Tesla network, the group Kryuchkov worked for could extort millions of dollars from the company. They had done it before. They would extract corporate data and affect operations, then demand a ransom to stop the data being released online, or for them to leave the Tesla operations alone. The unnamed staffer said they would think about it and left. They reported the incident to Tesla, who in turn contacted the FBI. This was a big break for investigators. Companies mostly focus on stopping cyber threats from outside forces, and stopping an attack from inside hadn't been much of a priority. Hiring someone from inside the company to place malware wasn't something many security experts had even heard about before. So uncovering the plot against Tesla likely saved numerous other companies and institutions from being attacked by the group and others like it. Working with the unnamed staffer, the FBI gathered evidence on Kryuchkov and the group. Kryuchkov offered to up the reward to $1 million for going through with the scheme, indicating he was confident they could get a lot of money. But at the last minute, he told the staffer to postpone the attack, as there had been a problem with another scheme he was running at the time. Kryuchkov tried to flee the country, but was arrested by the FBI in Los Angeles at the airport. One security firm director described the capture as a game changer, and the incident will likely change the future of cybersecurity. In October of 2014, Mostafa Ahmed Awad met with an Egyptian intelligence officer in a hotel room in Virginia. Awad had been born and raised in Egypt, but moved to the United States in 2007, and became a citizen in 2012. He now worked as a civil engineer at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth. He had access to plenty of classified information, including schematics for the USS Gerald R. Ford, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that was still under construction at the time. Awad hoped by giving these schematics to the Egyptian intelligence officer, Egypt would be able to create its own fleet. Even if they couldn't, Awad helpfully pointed out vulnerabilities in the ship. He highlighted exactly what would need to be hit in order for the ship to be sunk, potentially taking the lives of all 4,000 Navy service members stationed on board. He also boasted about being able to put tracking bugs on every ship that came into the shipyard, giving Egypt access to information on the US's entire fleet. Then he requested money for a pinhole camera, which he would use to gather even more classified information. Awad was a capable tracker and knew exactly how much danger he was putting himself in by doing this, but he still wanted to help Egypt. He and the intelligence officer spoke through encrypted emails, with each one being abandoned after just a single use, and dead drops in a park. According to Awad, it would take the FBI 10 years to decode the encrypted emails. Fortunately for the FBI, that wouldn't be the case. The Egyptian intelligence officer he'd been speaking with was actually an undercover FBI agent. It's not clear when exactly the Naval Criminal Investigative Services became suspicious of Awad, but the FBI got involved in the summer of 2014. In September, the agent contacted Awad directly via telephone, but Awad took control of the situation from there. Awad was happy to explain to the undercover officer how he believed providing Egypt with US technology was his life's mission, and he had turned down a lucrative job at a major defense contractor just so he could still have access to the information he wanted to steal. This wasn't about money to him. He was arrested in December of 2014 and pleaded guilty to attempted espionage. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. On April 28, 2019, the hard work of a number of FBI task forces and the Phoenix Police Department stopped a potential nuclear disaster that would have gone down as one of the area's scariest moments in history. Jared Atkins was 25 years old and had been living an apparently ordinary life when he completely snapped. He had been dealing with relationship problems, money problems, and family problems, but had mostly been keeping it together. That changed in the early hours of April that morning. At 12:30 a.m., he went to a gas station and attacked the worker there with a knife in the arm. After the attack, he calmly walked away as if nothing had happened. Atkins then drove to the Western Technologies building where he worked. Atkins had had a rough childhood and had gone through a lot of tragedy at a young age. Despite prejudices against him, he had attended the Aeronautics and Technology College and got a job at Western Technologies, where he had been working for 6 years. His job was maintaining radiological devices, meaning he had the skills to take them apart and put them back together again. And he knew how dangerous they were. He took 3 projectors, which were used to take X-ray photographs of objects deep underground. The projectors used a dangerous radioactive material that would cause significant damage in just a few short hours if someone were exposed to it. He then sent a message to some coworkers, telling them he had snapped and taken 3 devices. He wanted them to stay inside until they were found. Atkins wasn't entirely sure what his plan was. He drove to a mall, apparently with the intentions of spreading some of the radioactive material around the place, but the mall wasn't opened yet, so he changed his plan. He wanted to use the material to hurt himself and anyone who tried to stop him. There was also a plan to spread the material around himself, so he would be radiated along with any police officers who responded to his actions. But he also decided against that idea. He eventually went back home, where police and FBI agents found him. After a 2-hour standoff, Atkins gave himself up without releasing any toxic chemicals. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempting to use a weapon of mass destruction. In 2020, the FBI foiled an attempt to kidnap a sitting state governor. An almost year-long investigation resulted in more than a dozen people being charged with various offenses, including conspiracy to commit kidnapping and gang offenses. It's an understatement to say the political scene at the start of 2020 was pretty strained, as it would only get worse as the year went on. People who were unhappy with the situation founded communities online. Some of these groups wanted to make changes through peaceful routes, but many were hotbeds for radicalization and extremism. It was one of these more violent groups that a US Army veteran given the name Dan joined. He became disturbed at the use of hunting apps to track police officers, and informed a friend who worked for the local police about the group. The friend passed the information on to the FBI, and the FBI began investigating the group. Using a number of informants, including Dan, the FBI infiltrated the group. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer became the main target of their anger. The group was against her implementation of restrictions to slow the spread of COVID-19 and believed that she and other politicians were trying to destroy America. While Whitmer became the focus of their campaign, many members of the group had written violent threats against other politicians from both sides of the political divide. The group planned to kidnap Whitmer and considered possibly simultaneously attacking the homes of other government officials. They decided to target Whitmer while she and her family were at their vacation home on Birch Lake. They could kidnap her and either leave her on a boat in Lake Michigan without any power, or put her on trial as a tyrant in Wisconsin. Using the informants, the FBI was able to gather video and audio footage of preparations for the attack. The group constructed a model of the governor's vacation home, which they then used to practice their attacks. They also plotted to destroy one of the bridges leading up to the lakeside home to slow down law enforcement and other responders. In October, the FBI had enough evidence to arrest the group. 13 people were charged with state and federal crimes. So far, one has pleaded guilty, but the others have claimed to be the victims of FBI entrapment. At the moment, it's still unclear whether the FBI stopped a scary moment in history, or if they helped to plan one. In late 2020, Masih Alinejad received a visit from a group of FBI agents. They told her that there was a threat against her life. She wasn't too surprised, but this was much more serious than the usual threats she had been receiving for years. Masih was an Iranian-born journalist and author who had left the country in 2009 after speaking up against oppressive and discriminatory laws in the country. She had found her way to the United States and had been residing in Brooklyn, New York for years. She thought she was out of reach here. It hadn't been as easy for her family. They had been forced to stay behind in Iran and had been harassed since Masih left. The Iranian government tried to bribe them into luring Masih to the country where she could be kidnapped, but they refused. In the end, Masih's brother was arrested and sent to prison for crimes such as propaganda against the regime and insulting the Iranian leader. Masih was used to the online threats as she continued to rally support against various human rights violations in the country she once called home. But the FBI agents at her door were talking of something offline. For months, a private investigator, hired by members of the Iranian intelligence, had been taking photos and video recordings of Masih and her household. She was shown some of the images that had been captured, including photos of her stepson. The private investigators were even told to photograph her mail, but were told to be discreet, as they knew someone would be on the lookout for them. The investigators were under the impression Masih had fled to Dubai and had unpaid debts, and the people they were working for just wanted their money back. In reality, this footage was being used to prepare a kidnapping attempt. The group had done research into escape routes. Masih lived near the water, and the group planned to hire a military-style speedboat, which they could bundle her into. They also had researched maritime routes from New York to Venezuela, which is friendly with Iran. From there, she would be sent back to Iran to face trial for speaking out against the regime. Somehow, the FBI had managed to intercept some of the messages and had been able to warn Masih. She and her family were taken to safe houses. Masih spent several months separated from her children and under surveillance from the FBI, but it was ultimately for her own protection. One of the conspirators has been arrested, but 4 others remain at large in Iran, and it's unlikely they will face justice. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.